When people imagine scientific experiments, they usually picture lab coats, clipboards, and calm professionals nodding thoughtfully at charts. What they don't imagine is screaming, psychological collapse, or outcomes so disturbing that ethics boards later had to be invented specifically to prevent them from ever happening again. Unfortunately, science did not always come with guardrails. Before modern ethical standards, researchers were free to ask dangerous questions, such as, what happens if we do this to a human being? And then immediately conduct the experiment. These experiments were often approved, funded, and conducted by respected institutions. At the time, they were considered legitimate science. Looking back, they read less like research and more like deleted scenes from a horror movie. Here are 3 real experiments that actually happened, and probably shouldn't have. 3. The Stanford Prison Experiment, when pretending became terrifyingly real. In 1971, psychologist Philip Zimbardo wanted to study how people behave when given power or stripped of it. His idea seemed reasonable enough: simulate a prison environment and observe how normal people adapt to roles of guards and prisoners. The experiment was supposed to last 2 weeks. It didn't even make it to 1. Volunteers were randomly assigned roles. Guards were given uniforms, batons, and mirrored sunglasses. Prisoners were given numbers instead of names, humiliating clothing, and strict rules. Within days, the situation spiraled. Guards became abusive, not because they were told to, but because they could. They enforced arbitrary punishments, sleep deprivation, psychological torment, and public humiliation. Prisoners became passive, anxious, depressed, and emotionally broken. Some had mental breakdowns and had to be released early. Zimbardo himself became part of the problem. As the prison superintendent, he stopped seeing participants as volunteers and began treating the abuse as part of the experiment. It took an outside observer to finally say, "This is deeply wrong." The experiment was shut down after 6 days. Today, the Stanford Prison Experiment is taught as a cautionary tale, not about prisons, but about how quickly ordinary people can embrace cruelty when systems allow it. The real horror isn't that monsters were created, it's that none were needed. 2. The Little Albert Experiment, teaching a baby to be afraid of everything. In 1920, psychologist John B. Watson wanted to prove a theory that fear could be conditioned. In other words, humans aren't born afraid. Fear can be taught. To test this, he needed a subject. He chose a baby. Little Albert was around 9 months old when the experiment began. At first, Albert showed no fear of animals. Rats, rabbits, dogs, no problem. Watson decided to change that. Every time Albert was shown a white rat, Watson made a loud, terrifying noise by striking a steel bar with a hammer behind the child's head. The sound caused Albert to cry in distress. After several repetitions, the rat alone was enough to make Albert panic. Then, things got worse. Albert began showing fear not just of rats, but of anything white and fluffy. Rabbits, dogs, fur coats, even Santa Claus masks. The fear generalized, spreading across his world like a stain. The experiment ended without attempting to undo the damage. No therapy, no deconditioning, and no follow-up. Watson published his results proudly, proving his theory, while leaving behind a child whose emotional development may have been permanently altered. Modern psychology looks back on this experiment with collective horror. It didn't just cross ethical lines. It sprinted past them, set them on fire, and kept running. 1. The Tuskegee Syphilis Study, letting people die for data. If horror stories had a leaderboard, this one would be near the top. Beginning in 1932, the U.S. Public Health Service launched a study to observe the long-term effects of untreated syphilis. The subjects were hundreds of poor black men in Tuskegee, Alabama. They were told they were receiving treatment for bad blood. They were not. Even after penicillin became a known, effective cure in the 1940s, researchers deliberately withheld treatment. Doctors watched as participants suffered blindness, insanity, organ failure, and death. They recorded everything. The study continued for 40 years. Families were not informed. Consent was never properly given. Many wives and children were infected as a result. The experiment only ended when a whistleblower exposed it to the press in 1972. Public outrage was immediate and justified. The Tuskegee study didn't just destroy lives, it destroyed trust in medical institutions, a damage that still echoes today. This wasn't a mistake or oversight, it was a sustained decision to prioritize data over human life. These experiments weren't conducted by mad scientists hiding in basements. They were run by respected academics, funded by institutions, and justified by the belief that knowledge was worth the cost. The problem was deciding who paid that cost. Modern ethical standards exist because of experiments like these. Consent forms, review boards, and strict guidelines weren't invented out of caution. They were invented out of regret. The unsettling truth is that these horror stories didn't come from ignorance. They came from confidence, from the belief that the end justified the means. Science learned a lot from these experiments. Unfortunately, the people involved paid far too much for that education.